Thank you so much, Craig. I'm so excited to be here and to talk, and I'm looking forward to getting down to Utah soon. Let me just share my screen for everyone to see. And let's talk about avalanche problems, planning, and manageability. And I was at the conference last winter, and so some of this is actually going to be review, but I'm feeling like it just started snowing, people are getting out, and I want to do a little vocabulary review as well as dive into some new concepts. And so I'm sure folks are getting excited, and when we get ready to go touring for the day, we're thinking about all sorts of variables. And if you're like me, you go straight to the Utah Avalanche Center to get information in the morning and the evening before, to start thinking about tour planning. And when I think about going to the forecast center, all of the forecast centers around the US and in Canada and all over the world are using some vocabulary that in theory is really simple, but actually offers a ton of information. So I want to start tonight with just a vocabulary review or introduction and really get us thinking about how we communicate with our partners. And when we're going to the forecast, the vocabulary of the forecast includes a few things. One, they give us the avalanche hazard rating: low, moderate, considerable, high, extreme. They also give us some different avalanche problems sometimes, and this can actually really help us around choosing which terrain we want to travel in for the day. And then there's also travel advice embedded both in the avalanche hazard rating as well as in the forecast. So let's talk a little bit about this. And let's start with this vocabulary. And I was talking to my husband, Don, who's going to speak tomorrow night. And we were talking about why we think this vocabulary around risk and around avalanche forecasting is so important and why we keep talking about it. And one of the things is I feel like travel in the backcountry is so complex and so complicated that if we can put explicit language around risk and around analyzing the risk, this gives us a better opportunity to make good decisions and also to have good discussions with our partners and understand maybe what we're getting into a little bit more. So I want to start with a few definitions, hazard versus risk. And when I think about hazard, the definition is basically an agent that has the potential to cause harm. And so this just exists. It's not anything being inserted into it. It's just out there. There's a hazard, avalanche hazard, there's rockfall hazard, there's these things that just exist. And then risk measures the likelihood of harm from an existing hazard. So in order to have risk, you have to insert something into the hazard. And so to translate that into the snow and avalanche vocabulary, and again, if you saw this last year, take this as a refresher, that's my goal. When we think about hazard in the world of snow and avalanches, we think about the North American Public Avalanche Danger Scale. And in our case, danger is used synonymously with hazard. So this just exists. The avalanche hazard exists. The avalanche danger exists in the mountains. And it can go anywhere from low all the way to extreme. But as you're getting ready for a year in the backcountry, take the time to find this scale. You can either find it on Google or you can find it on the UAC website and dig deeper to understand the definition of moderate or the definition of considerable, because there's a lot more than just that word. There's travel advice, there's the likelihood of avalanches, and then there's where the avalanches can be found. And so right off the bat, when the forecasters are issuing an avalanche hazard rating, they're trying to have a conversation about risk with us. And let's dig deeper. What is risk? Well, the risk is the probability of loss or the probability of gain, right? In the mountains, there exists risk when we go backcountry skiing or climbing, but it's not just a probability of loss. There's this probability of gain. We wouldn't do it otherwise. And so when I think about risk, I think about four components. We have the likelihood of something happening and the consequence of it. And we can evaluate that without actually inserting something in to this risk formula. We can just sort of think about, oh, today with the avalanche hazard being this and avalanches being triggered this widespread, the likelihood of triggering something is high, and the consequence, well, that depends on my terrain and it depends on the avalanche problem and how deep it is. But then to dig really deep into the risk formula, we insert something into risk, and in my case, as a very kind wife, I have put my husband in risk. And when we're evaluating risk, we're also thinking about our vulnerability and our exposure to whatever existing hazard. And so I want to dig into this really quick. Again, some of this is review, but let's use this to begin to have conversations with our backcountry partners as we get ready for a full backcountry season. And so when we think about likelihood, we talked about likelihood and consequence. We think about likelihood. If you are an engineer, you might be thinking about likelihood of either on a scale of 0 or at 1. It's impossible or it's definitely going to happen. It's certain. But in most of our lives, and definitely in backcountry travel, most of the time we exist in between 0 and 1. And so we live in a world of uncertainty. And so trying to evaluate the likelihood of triggering an avalanche can be quite tricky. And this is why we begin with the forecasters in the forecast center to help us begin to gauge that. But when I'm thinking about the likelihood of triggering an avalanche, my terrain selection looks quite different. If I think it's highly unlikely to trigger an avalanche that day, I might choose higher consequence terrain. And if I feel like it's highly likely to trigger an avalanche, I'm going to choose really different terrain. I'm not going to travel in that big terrain. So I'm going to think about the likelihood when I'm starting to think about risk. The other thing I'm going to think about is the consequence or the impact of something happening. What happens if I trigger an avalanche at the top of this slope? What happens? Is it just a twisted knee, or is it I could get killed? And evaluating that is really important. This is where we start our conversation about risk, which influences our choices for the day. What's the likelihood of something happening? What's the impact of that thing happening? And then we talk about vulnerability. And when I think about vulnerability, I think about the susceptibility to the impact of the hazard. So if I'm most concerned in this case about icefall hazard, and this person is climbing without a rope, and they're soloing, then they are quite vulnerable to the impact of the icefall hazard, right? If a chunk of ice falls off, hits this person in the head, and they pitch off the cliff, that impact of that hazard is high. I can change the vulnerability of the climber. It's me in this case, so I'm not trying to throw anyone else off a cliff. I can change the vulnerability by putting a rope on this climber. So and if I put a rope on this climber, I change the overall risk equation of the day. I might change my vulnerability as a skier by choosing different terrain. I might also change my vulnerability by wearing a helmet, by wearing an airbag. If I'm driving a car and I'm concerned about sliding off the road, I change my vulnerability by wearing a seatbelt. So there's all sorts of ways that we can pull the lever around the risk equation and change the overall risk. And one way is looking at our vulnerability and seeing if we can adapt our behavior, modify our behavior to change the overall risk equation. And then the fourth portion of the risk equation is exposure. And Grant Statham gave a great talk on this risk equation, and he calls exposure the gas pedal of risk, because oftentimes exposure is basically what terrain we choose to travel in on any given day. And are you all in the case with this skier, running right down the center of the line of a full, 38, 40 degree slope? Or can you choose different terrain? And if I choose low angle terrain, I'm going to change my risk exposure. Other outside examples, I can change my exposure if I'm an investor by diversifying and not having all of my money in one stock. So I can think about that as well. And if I change my exposure, I change that overall risk equation as well. Other variables that avalanche forecasters are going to talk about, or your partners when you're ski touring or snowmobiling, are the avalanche problems. And the reason we keep talking about the avalanche problems along with the avalanche hazard is that these avalanche problems are managed very differently, and they react very differently. And we're going to dig into this a little bit more. But I want to remind you, I put this graphic up last year. When the avalanche forecasters are putting out a forecast for the day, they're going to start with the type of the avalanche problem. Do we have wind slabs for the day, or storm slabs, or persistent slabs? And where are they? And as they're thinking about this, they're going to start thinking about that formula of risk. The sensitivity to triggering, how sensitive is this snow to triggering avalanches? And how widespread is this avalanche problem? Is it all over on all aspects and all elevations? Or is it in limited places? Is going to influence, those two pieces are going to influence the likelihood of triggering an avalanche. Widespread sensitive snowpack you're going to see a much higher likelihood to triggering avalanches than a pockety avalanche problem that's really stubborn and no one's triggered an avalanche in 5 days. Then it's going to be a lower likelihood of triggering. And then for the consequence, the way that we use it is we substitute the destructive size of the avalanche. The bigger the avalanche you can trigger, the higher the consequence may be. Now we can sort of adapt that consequence by choosing different terrain. But for this formula, likelihood of triggering an avalanche, destructive size, then we put out, the forecasters put out the avalanche hazard rating. In real life, these lines are not straight. They wander around, and I've had that conversation with numerous forecasters. But this for me is actually a really good visualization around avalanche hazard. So the forecasters might rate it low or high or considerable, somewhere in there, but you have to dig deeper because there might be a day where it's moderate hazard and it's highly likely that you're going to trigger a small avalanche, like a day where it's storm snow. It might also be a day where it's very low likelihood that you're going to trigger a persistent slab avalanche, and you're going to manage things very differently. So when I go through the forecast, I'm going to first look at the hazard rating, and then I'm going to start taking this in consideration, the avalanche problems, the likelihood of them being triggered, the size of them. And this is how I'm going to adapt in terms of what terrain I'm going to choose. Because remember, exposure, terrain is my gas pedal of risk. So if the avalanche hazard is at high elevations, I'm going to choose to not travel at high elevations. And then I think about margin. Do I have room to make mistakes? And ideally, I'm choosing terrain and traveling on days where one error isn't going to be fatal. So keep this in mind. But for me, the interesting thing is lately I've been sitting in with guiding operations that I work with, or just talking to partners, and there's this conversation around manageability. And I want to ask a little bit more about this. So with the risk formula, we think about the likelihood, we think about the consequences, we think about what avalanche problems are present. And then there's this conversation about manageability. And where it's entered is oftentimes we talk about storm slabs being more manageable and persistent slabs being less manageable. And this is really only if you enter avalanche terrain, because a great way to manage these problems is to avoid avalanche terrain. But if we enter avalanche terrain, it's important to understand what avalanche problems we might be seeing. And I'm speeding up because I have a cue that I'm going a little long. There's this great toolbox that Drew Hardesty and Wendy Wagner put out. It's the Avalanche Problem Toolbox. And I would recommend looking in the UAC blog to find this. There is the avalanche problem. The icon looks a little different. There's a description. And then there's this bottom box that I think is really important to key in on. The avalanche behavior, if you can remote trigger this avalanche problem or not, and how useful tests and observations are. And so when I think about manageability, I'm thinking about a variety of things. I'm thinking about how deep the slab is, how sensitive the snowpack is, the size of the terrain. But really what I'm looking at is thinking about the avalanche behavior, and if I can remote trigger, and what my tests and observations show. And my slide disappeared on this. But when I think about persistent slabs, it's really unpredictable in terms of where I might trigger these avalanches. So that is a strike against them. I can remote trigger persistent slab problems and deep slab problems. Again, harder to manage, makes it scarier. And my tests and observations are not often reliable. So when I see persistent slabs and deep slabs on the forecast, I back way off. I find that really scary. Versus when I think about storm slab problems, they tend to be more predictable. They tend to break at my feet. I'm not very likely to remote trigger these, and my tests and observations are quite useful. So here's that vision of deep slab. And then here's the slide of storm slab. It's more predictable. It's less likely to trigger them. My tests and observations are more reliable. So while when I see persistent slabs and deep slabs, I back way off on my terrain choices and don't find it manageable, I also don't think deep storms like you get in the Wasatch are manageable at times. And for us as backcountry travelers, our job is avalanche avoidance. So we need to consider this. So when we're seeing deep slabs or persistent slabs, when we're seeing forecasters saying pay attention, I want to think about the impact of the terrain that I choose on the manageability of my day. And if I choose terrain that is really constricted and really confined, any avalanche problem becomes unmanageable because the consequences of getting caught in an avalanche mean that I can't escape it. So if I choose wider open terrain where I can move about, where it might be lower angle, I can change that whole risk equation. This has very different risk and manageability than this. Interestingly, a lot of avalanche practitioners get caught in wind slabs. And I think that wind slabs are often referred to as being manageable, but I don't think they're that manageable. And in part because they're highly variable. Sometimes they're thick, sometimes they're thin, sometimes they're hard, sometimes they're soft. I think we often, as more experienced users, overestimate our ability to escape a problem, or we underestimate the size or the impact of the problem. And I also think that as backcountry travelers, since our job is avalanche avoidance, we don't actually understand the true definition of what an avalanche problem is if it's manageable. Because we ideally have not been caught in many avalanches. We haven't triggered very many avalanches, and we haven't escaped very many avalanches. So we don't have a deep well of experience to draw on. And we live in a world of a wicked learning environment. We don't get direct feedback when we're out in the backcountry. So when we're thinking about choosing terrain and having conversations with our partners, if you hear the word manageability pop in, think about this. How can we learn if something is manageable or not manageable? One, talk to people who have been caught in avalanches and begin to understand if an avalanche problem might be manageable. Because you might be surprised at how small of an avalanche could sweep someone off their feet and make it a very unmanageable situation. Be humble. And I challenge all of us to just find humility, and especially at the start of the season, take a step back. Learn from your partners, learn from the environment, and strive to be a realist. Even though we all want to be heroes, I would argue that most of us actually can't manage the avalanche problems that we have maybe fooled ourselves into walking into in the past. Dip your toe into the water. I say this at the start of the season, and I say this at the start of a tour day. If you can assess terrain in small bits before jumping into the gut of a big slope, you're going to be way better set up for success. And you're going to be way better set up to adapt your plan for the day. And then build in margin if you can. Think about where you're headed and if you have room to make errors, or if one error is going to be fatal. So in terms of gathering information and talking about manageability, one, I don't believe that the word manageability is being used very well. So maybe think about throwing it out. But as you're starting to talk with your backcountry partners, start using a common vocabulary or language around risk. And if it's this, great. And if it's a different vocabulary, great. Just make sure you're saying the same things and assessing the same things. Think about your terrain, because that is your gas pedal of risk. And then learn from others and learn from yourself. And we as backcountry travelers don't have a ton of experience around avalanche problems. So if you really want to dig deep and learn about avalanche problems, start talking to ski patrollers. They're the ones that go hunting for avalanches. They have more experience. We can learn a lot from them as well. Thank you very much. And I am here for any questions.
Hey, Sarah, thanks for joining us tonight. It is great to see you, and we always so appreciate all of your experience and everything you bring to the table here. So a couple of things that I'm hearing. First, right, as backcountry travelers, we're not avalanche hunters, we're avalanche avoiders. So that's one that we can definitely take to the bank. And then secondly, I like that concept of starting off with a little mini golf before starting to step into big terrain. Yeah, dip your toe into that water and see how things are reacting before committing to big terrain. So thanks for all of that insight. And I know you just bring a ton of experience to the table. And speaking of experience, with more experience and maybe days in the field, a user's perceived risk may, of course, decrease. So how do you keep from forming a bias in your perceived risk over time?
Yeah, it's a great question. And this is why I've started to talk about manageability. And how I've worked on it is to talk to my friends who have more experience around avalanches. So those patrollers, and then other friends who have been caught and captured, and just keep gaining a realistic view of what it's like to get caught. And I also had the unfortunate experience of getting caught in an 8-inch wind slab that took me 1,600 feet. So that memory gave me the biggest slice of humble pie that I could have. And I hope no one else has to have that experience to have the humble pie slice.
Wow, thanks for sharing that. And got another question here from our listener viewer audience. And did last winter's challenging season change your view on how manageable or not manageable persistent weak layers are?
You know, it didn't. I have always been scared of persistent slab problems, but what it changed my view on is how we build community knowledge and how we build deep community knowledge, because I felt like last year we had a snowpack that was a 20-year snowpack. We don't see it that often. And so even as backcountry travelers who have 5 or 10 years of experience, where that's a lot of days in the backcountry, but people haven't seen all of those things. And so really what it shifted for me is, or it's put that question of like, how do we build community knowledge and emphasize like, no, this year I'm actually really scared. It's really different. And so that's a question I keep kicking around, and I would love to keep talking to people and figure out a way to do that.
Yeah, great concept, right? Even maybe with a decade or so of experience, sometimes we never get to see some of the snow layering setups that we experienced last year. So definitely, man, that threw a curveball into our zone as well. Thanks for sharing that. I've got one last question for you, Sarah, and we could stay here all night. I mean, you are just a college of avalanche knowledge, and we're super grateful for that. But what do you find is the most successful way to communicate with other groups that are recreating in a similar area, especially when they pose a hazard to you or other nearby groups? Do you have any strategies, methodologies you could share?
I think more and more zones are using radios and having common radio channels. So I think that can actually be quite useful. I think using a common vocabulary can be really helpful of here's the hazard I saw, here's the avalanche problems, here's the terrain we're trying to go to. And then if you can't communicate, I just see it as my responsibility to get out of the way, honestly, change my terrain. Because all of us, the only thing we can really manage is our terrain selection. And so that is always my bottom line, is terrain is the answer.